Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar today on part 2 of getting started with switch access in Grid 3. So what I thought I'd start with today is just to say about who this webinar is for. So we're going to assume in this webinar that you already have established the right switch and the right switch position for the user, for someone who's going to use a switch. That you're interested in fine-tuning that switch access, so looking at some of the more advanced options to either improve efficiency, speed, reduce fatigue, for example, and that you're aiming to also achieve something which is as sustainable as possible too. Okay, so one of the things that I would advise you to do if you are new to this is to go back and look at part 1 of our webinar. So in part 1, one of the things that we looked at was, let's just bring up a slide to show you some of the things that were covered. We looked at what a switch actually is, what switch access looks like. We looked at switch scanning in both symbol and text communication content within Grid 3. Choosing how your switch would actually work in terms of, for example, what we would call a scanning pattern. Being able to adapt the content within Grid to make the content as it's displayed on the screen as efficient as possible. And then also thinking about someone who's just starting out on the road, or perhaps using switch as a method of access to a computer or to communication, and looking at building skills there, whether it's for a young child or for an adult with who's new to switch access. And finally, we looked at some resources that would help you along the way. So that's what we've got to so far in our previous webinar, which you'll find via our website. Today, what we're going to look at, let's just bring up some of what we're going to cover today. Okay, so in today's webinar, we're going to have a look at some alternative methods for switch selection. So how your switch actually works when you press it. We'll explore some more scanning modes, how the pattern on the screen is displayed. Being able to extend the function of your switches by implementing things like a long hold for a different action. Looking at some advanced switch scanning options built into Grid 3. Again, looking a bit more in a bit more depth at the efficiency of your layout and how you can improve that. We'll look at some auditory scanning options. We'll also look at some alternative scanning methods to the more commonly known switch scan. We'll look at some of the alternatives that are built into Grid for that, and some of the additional hardware that can help with that. And finally, we'll look at using a switch with computer control. And again, I'll provide some hints and tips of where you can find some additional resources to support the development and use of successful use of switch access. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'm going to switch now to Grid. So let me just transition to that. So hopefully now you can see my screen, and you can also hopefully see me in a window as well, which I'll use to demonstrate how I'm using switches in just a second. So let's start with how you can change the way in which your switch works when you press it. I'm going to go up to the menu bar. So if you watched the previous webinar or have watched other Grid 3 webinars on our website, you'll be familiar with the menu bar. Just select anywhere on the top bar, and then we're going to go to settings. And in today's webinar, we're going to spend most of our time in the settings screen because without any apology, there's lots of settings for switch access. You need them if you really want to fine-tune your switch access, and that after all is what today's webinar is all about: fine-tuning, getting the most out of those switches. So I've gone to access, and then I'm going to visit switches. So my starting point, I'm going to start down in the configuration section of the settings screen. Last time we looked at how to make your connection, and you can see here today I can very quickly check that my switches are working. And today, just so you know, I've got a couple of different switches here. I happen to have a buddy switch and a smoothie switch. Okay, so just two different buttons that I'm using, and when I press one, I can see I'm lighting up in a second. So I'm happy that both are working. So let's go back a level. Okay, the joys of working at home with a barking dog. Let's continue. So we brought the settings screen up. We're going to now visit switch presses. And in switch presses, there are some screens here. First of all, to test your switches, as I've just done, and you can see that is working there. The one we want to have a look at quickly now is the accept option. So you have a choice in grid of either making your selection with a switch as you press it or as you release it. And the default is out on as you press the switch. Okay. But you may need, later on, we're going to need to switch that to switch on release so that we can make use of the long hold functions of a switch. So adding a second option to a switch. And if you're going to use that, you're going to need this option. We'll look at that later. But just to demonstrate that, I'm going to hold a switch up to the camera. And as I press where I've got accept on switch press, if I now press my switch, as I press it, instantly you can see the switch tester working. If I switch that to switch on release, you can now see as I first press the switch, there's no light, but as I release it, okay, you get the acceptance. So that really depends on the user. More often than not, accept on first press is most useful because your action happens instantaneously. It doesn't matter if it takes you a moment or a few moments to release the switch, but if you're trying to speak a phrase, turn the volume down on your television, whatever it is you're using your switch for, you probably want to have it the moment you press your switch. But in certain circumstances, the release function can be helpful, as for example with long hold. So we're going to leave that as accept on switch press. The next option to look at is accidental presses. So quite often when you're working with someone who's using switches, is their fine motor control can be challenging for them, and you get all sorts of accidental presses or accidental movements which impact on the selections you're making on the successful use of the switch. So there's a couple of different things that you can put in place, and these are sometimes referred to as filters. Let's turn them on. There's a couple of filters here. The first option is to ignore short presses. So if I turn that on for a moment, you have a slider that you can alter. So I'm just going to exaggerate my options here so that we can see it clearly on the screen. So I'll turn that up to 0.4 of a second. And what that means is that as I press a very short press, you can see that the switch tester is showing red, which means that press is not long enough to be accepted. If I do a firm press, it's accepted. So you can imagine someone who perhaps has got a bit of a tremor, and then they manage a firm press. That can be quite useful. The next option is to have ignore repeat presses within a certain length of time. So somebody who makes a press but then repeats the press several times. This might be somebody who, for example, just has got a motor pattern that makes that happen. They get overexcited while they're using their switch. So it can be useful, particularly sometimes when you're first starting with switch access, perhaps with a young child, is to say accept the first option, but don't accept anything for maybe, in this case, I'm going to exaggerate the option, what have I got? Let's just reduce that to 1 second. So anything after my selection, within 1 second of that, will be ignored. So I can make a selection, that's fine. I can make another selection, but if I press again now, these extra follow-on presses are being ignored. I've got to release, and that's accepted, and that's accepted. So anything within that timing can be accepted. So ignore short presses, ignore repeat presses. So there are two useful filters to be aware of. One tip, I touched on this last time, every time you're exploring switch access, you can go down rabbit holes of different settings. This restore defaults option is quite useful if you just want a clean slate, just to start again and try something different. Let's go back up a level. So what we're going to have a look at now is how we can make some changes to the way in which the switch scanning is working. So I'm going to explore something first of all called hold to advance. So most of these settings in this next period, for these next few minutes, is going to be happen under activation. So the default option would be to have scan rows and then cells, and that's what we explored in our last webinar. And to have the option automatically advance. And that will be a fairly default setup. I'll just make sure I've restored all those settings. But we can also explore an option where you use a switch to move on manually. So at the moment, just to remind you, if you're using just one switch, the computer would allow the scan to move, and your single switch would make the selection when you got to where you wanted to go. So let's try a tap to advance this time. I'm going to start by introducing a second switch. So I have an activate switch, in other words a choosing switch set to switch 1, and my secondary moving switch, in this language advance or moving switch, I'll set to switch 2, and I'll just check again that both switches are selected. Okay, so let's just test how that's going to work first of all. So I'm going to use this useful test grid, and I'll continue to use this a fair bit today. So I'm pressing a single switch, my green switch, and I'm moving. I'm then choosing with my other switch, but I'm in full control of the speed at which that's happening. So some users will like that because there is no time constraint going on here. There's no time pressure. They can take as long or they can be as fast as they want. Or if they want to take their time, they can slow down. Okay, so that's called tap to advance. So we can also use tap to advance. We can also use a different way of doing that would be to use hold to advance. So let's then switch from tap to advance to hold to advance. So what I'm now going to do, how is that going to work? So we're going to go back to our test grid, and this time as I'm pressing my switch I'm holding it down, and the hold is then moving through at the timing that I've set. I haven't changed that, actually it's default. When I release it stops. I can select with my second switch, and then I can move again by holding my switch down. And again, for someone who can hold a switch without difficulty, that's kind of a nice low pressure way of using your switches. So that's called hold to advance. So let's take that a step further and think about what if we wanted to use that feature that was working well, the hold to advance was working well, but someone didn't have a second switch. So one thing you could introduce here is something called dwell to select. So I'm going to choose instead of activate being switch 1, I'm going to change my activation method to be a dwell. And the dwell is set here with a timer, with a slider, and the default is 2 seconds, and I'll leave it at that just for demonstration purposes. Let's go into the test grid and have a look at how that works. So this time I'm only going to be using a single switch. I'm just using my moving switch, my green switch. I'm going to press my switch, and I'm going to choose. Okay, let's just do that one more time. Okay, so this time I'm holding my switch down. I've got hold to advance set. I'm going to go for the 4th row, and then I've got where I want to go, release, and a dwell is made. I can take my time, I can take my hand away, I can think about it. Then I want that row, so I'm going to hold, and I'm going to move along, and all the time I'm holding it until I get to the 4th cell. I'm going to release because that's the one I want, and that bit, that dwell, is happening automatically. So hold, in this case, to advance, and then release. And that feature of dwelling could be used with a tap to advance as well. So I think one point to make on that dwell to select option is there is a time pressure that's introduced there, so you do have to have good control, so bear that in mind, but useful to know about. So let's move on to another feature. I'm just going to restore my defaults one more time. And we're going to look at a more advanced feature now, less commonly used, but incredibly helpful for someone with good cognitive ability and good control. And that is swap scan. So I'm going to turn that on. And it's here. At the moment, you can see that it's grayed out. So swap scan needs to be used with two switches, not just with one. So I'm going to change my option here to tap to advance. And now you can see it's been lit up. So I'm just going to choose my advanced switch to be switch 2, my activate switch to be switch 1. There we go. I'll turn swap scan on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to switch to the test grid. And you're going to need to watch my little window quite carefully for a moment. I'll try and explain how this is happening. So I'm going to move as usual, using the green switch. And I want to get to that third row, so I'm going to make a selection. Okay, but now the actions of the two switches have swapped. So now my yellow switch is my moving switch. So I'm going to keep pressing my yellow switch until I get to where I want to go. And then I can activate with my green switch. But now my green switch has swapped again after making a selection. So my green switch is now my moving switch. Okay. You might think, well, gosh, that seems complicated. Why would you do that? Well, it is complicated. There is a cognitive load associated with it, but it can also be incredibly efficient for someone. Let's imagine someone's using head switches. So if I move, make a selection, my head is now on this switch or near the switch, my movement has moved to that switch. I can then continue with that second switch until I get to where I want to go. Make my selection, I've moved my head position, and now I'm where I need to be to carry on. And that's called swap scan. And for someone who can get into that routine, that motor pattern, it's much more efficient. There's much less body movement required to get yourself in a good position. So actually, someone who's struggling with their body position, that can be something that's worth exploring. But they just need to get their head around that quite complex setting. Okay, so that was called swap scan. Let's move on now. I'm going to restore my defaults. And we're going to have a look now at how we can make use of long holds. So I touched on this right at the beginning of the day, and the first thing we need to do is set our switch presses options up correctly. So in order for long holds to be available, we need to have accept on switch release. So I turn long holds on. Sometimes it takes a moment just to activate. And there's a slider here to decide how long your long hold needs to be before it makes its action. So I'm just going to reduce that for demo purposes a little bit. Let's go down to 2.5 seconds or so. Okay. And I also quite like this option here that says, when I've held my switch down long enough, play a little sound cue so I know I've held it. So what I'll try now is I'll just demonstrate it. So I'm holding up my switch, I'm going to press my switch. And you may have just heard that bloop, which is the indicator that I've held my switch for 2.5 seconds and something else can happen with it. Right, so I'm set up and ready to go. Now let's try and set up a switch scan. So let's go into activation again. So I'm going to this time use an automatic advance. I'm going to just use a simple row then cell scan. And I'm going to set up my long hold to do something. So if I scroll down this screen, one of the things that we can do is we can, for example, set up an option to cancel the scan, to come out of the scan if I make a mistake. So I'm just going to choose the option here that says hold switch 1, stop scan. So you'll notice now that because I've turned long holds on, that long holds are being made available for the switches, for each of the switches. I'll have a long hold option. So let's just see how that's going to work. Let's go into test grid. So I'm going to press my switch. I'm scanning. I've gone into the wrong row. Press, hold, release, and my scan has cancelled. Do that again, and then this time I can go, and I'm now in the right row, and I can carry on. So once again, if I do a long hold, stops where it gets to, it doesn't make a selection, it just comes out of the scan because I've set my long hold to cancel. So how else can we use the long hold? So let's go back here. I'm going to choose this time to do a tap to advance. I'm going to have two switches therefore. And this time I'm going to have an option under my further options that says, I'm going to take the stop scan. I'm going to leave the stop scan on switch 1, but maybe I want to have back up one level set to switch 2. A switch 2 long hold. So just a reminder, switch 1 and switch 2. So switch 2 now is back up one level. Switch 1 is my normal scan and switch, but I can also cancel with. Okay. For ease of, let's just go into that and have a look. So I'm scanning. Okay, I'm moving along. Okay, I've actually made a mistake here. I've gone into the wrong row, but actually I wanted to do is to get to the 4th row. So I'm going to back up a level by long holding my green switch. And then I can carry on and get to where I wanted to go. I'll just do that one more time. So I'm scanning down. I've accidentally gone into the wrong row. I went into the 3rd row. I do a long hold. It comes out of the row but doesn't cancel the scan. That's called back up one level. And then carry on. Okay, do that one more time. Didn't do a very good demonstration there. So I'm going to aim for the 3rd row, but I've gone too soon. Oops. 3rd row. Made my selection, I've gone into the wrong row, long hold, and as you to back up a level, I can scan down to my 3rd row, make my selection and move along. Okay, so that's called back up one level, and you can set that to a switch, you can set that to a long hold, lots of different ways you can explore a long hold in that way, and it's a So one more way which I like to use for a long hold, one other way I think is really powerful for a long hold, is to use a long hold for example, a command. So I'm just going to restore my default. So we've got a blank slate. I'm going to go just check my long hold is still left on. It is. So now what I want to do is I want to set up a command which, in this case, I'm going to make my long hold play a sound. So I've gone to the option that says commands. So under activation, you've got an area called commands here. I'm going to add a switch, and it's going to be a long hold on switch 1. So I'm envisaging or imagining a user who's only using a single switch. They have an automatic scan, but they can successfully and reliably hold down a switch for a couple of seconds, and they can differentiate between that and their brief normal selection. So on my long hold, I'm going to add a command, and the command I'm going to add is a simple play sound command. And I'm just going to browse for a sound. Let's just have a bell or an alarm. Let's have a boxing ring bell. Oh no, let's have a bugle. Just check it's not too long. Click on OK. It's a silly sound, but we'll use it just for demonstration. So we've added a sound to a long hold on switch 1. Back a level, into activation, and then into my test grid. So I'm going to press my switch to start scanning. I'm just using a single switch here for scanning. Okay, I want to wake somebody up, call for someone's attention. I'm going to long hold my switch. Okay, and you heard the sound being played. So, where that really might be helpful, it can be useful to set off an alarm sound. But the other way to think about it is there are commands in the grid, for example, to send an instant text message. So you could add a command that says, send an instant text message that says, help now, whenever I do my long hold. But you're just going to make sure that someone is able to differentiate between their normal selection hold and a longer hold being used for something else. Okay. Let's just take that away. So we've then had a good explore of a long hold action, making someone a 1.5 switch user, and just a reminder that those long holds can be set up for more than one switch and a multitude of different actions if you want. And those settings, if I come out of test grid, those further options that can usually be applied to a long hold are useful to explore. So back up one level, we're going to look at reverse scan in a moment, stop scan are all things that are helpful to do. What we're going to have a look at now is something where a user might be wanting to repeat their last selection with the activate switch. So rather than having to scan through, for example, to make a double letter. So rather than having to scan through to the same letter again, taking a long time, if they've just selected a letter E, they can press their same switch again to repeat that selection. So I'm just going to set that up and demonstrate it in a keyboard grid. So I'm going to start by just setting this up to a tap to advance and just again setting one switch to move and one to select. Okay, so I've got activate and advance there and they're both working. So now that I've set this up for 2 switch scanning, I then have an option to repeat previous selections with the activate switch, which I'm going to turn on. So let's click on OK. I'm going to go into Fast Talker. And then I'm going to go to my chat keyboard. Okay, so I'm on my chat keyboard. And I'm going to begin to, maybe I want to select a double E. Okay, so I'm going to make my, oops. So, I'm going to go down to my E. I've got to my E. I'm going to select it. But if I now press my selection switch a second time, you can see that a double E has appeared. So I'm not having to scan through to that letter to get the same thing again. So I'll do the same thing with a double T, for example, or double S might be a better example. I'm scanning down using my green switch. I get to I want to go in the normal way. I select, and then if I select again, okay, it will repeat my letter. And that can be used not just with a keyboard. It could be to repeat if the last thing you did was to speak something and someone says, can you just repeat that please? Pressing your switch again will repeat that same selection. Okay, and I think it's worth remembering that you shouldn't often get errors with that, because after selecting a switch, your normal action is to start using your choosing switch thereafter, so it wouldn't be impacted. It's only if you press your activate switch, your choosing switch twice in a row, that repeat selection can be helpful. Okay, so let's go back into settings and then back into access, switches, and what we're going to have a look at now is a couple of other options which are helpful to improve efficiency. So up until now, whenever I wanted to start switch scanning, I've got to press a switch to start the scan process. So something that can speed that up is an option that says start scanning automatically. So automatically start scan, if I switch that on, and I'm just going to turn the option I've just shown you off, the repeat selection off for ease of use here. So if I go into my test grid now and start scanning, this is best demonstrated with an automatic scan. So let's just do that. Okay. So go to my test grid. So I'm going to press my switch to start, make my selection, and automatically the scan has started again. I haven't had to press a switch to start. I'm going to choose the third cell, and this time it's automatically starting the scan. Okay. Now, in terms of how many times will it scan through, that's usually set at the bottom here of the further options. We have a number of times in which a scan will rotate through your grid before it just stops. And at the moment, the default is 3, but you can see there are some choices there, included unlimited or just once. So what we're going to do now is have a look at some more advanced options and ways in which we can reverse the direction in which a scan is happening. So I've come back into our switch scanning section. So I'm in the activate options of switch scanning. And I'm going to start by switching on something that says scan backwards before activating. By default, that'll be off. I'm going to switch that on. I'm just going to set my time here. I have a slider, and I'll set that to 1.5 seconds. So that is a period, the time at which, the speed at which the scan will happen backwards. I've also set this up for a single switch to automatically advance, and for demonstration purposes, and actually quite commonly with this access method, you would scan cells one at a time. I'm scanning quite quickly at 0.4 seconds, and what's going to happen in my test grid in a moment, you'll see me scan past my chosen target because I've got it just so fast, but then I'm able to step backwards more slowly. The purpose of it is it can be faster to get to where you want to go, but without requiring you to be absolutely accurate with your timing. Let's have a look and see how that works. I'm pressing my switch. Wrong switch. The yellow switch. And you can see it's moving quite quickly now. Now I want something on my 4th row. So I press my switch and it's moving much more slowly backwards, giving me time to make my selection. So I'll do that one more time with the yellow switch. This time I'm going to go for something on the 2nd row. It's fast. It's probably faster than I can cope with, but that's okay. Press my switch once, it's now slowed right down, allowing me to hit the switch I want. So sometimes called overscan, but scanning backwards before activating is the option. So another way that could be used is if I switch that option off. There is also an option down here that says reverse scan direction. So you can have an option that says I can be an automatic scanner, for example, but I can set up a second switch to reverse my direction. Perhaps I have made a mistake, but I want to occasionally use that second switch. So switch 2 to reverse scan, and activated switch 1. So let's see how that works. I'm just going to go back to a normal row column scan, and I'm just going to increase the speed back to a more normal couple of seconds just for demonstration purposes. And I will increase the speed. There we go. That's fine. That's all okay. So I'm using a scan speed of 1.8 seconds. Let's just see how that works. So I'm going to start scanning. I'm using a single switch. I'm going into my 3rd row. I want the 2nd cell, but actually I've missed it. So I'm just going to press my other switch, and you can see it's just reversed the direction. So let's do that one more time. I'll go for the 2nd row this time. I'm going for the third cell, but I'm going to miss it by mistake. I've missed it, so I'm going to now press my second switch that lets me reverse up and having a second chance of hitting my cell. Okay. So that option can also be applied to a long hold that we explored earlier and can be quite a useful thing. A long hold to say, just reverse up for a minute. Okay. Okay, let's move on to something different now. So we're going to talk a little bit now about content and scan blocks. We touched on them in the last webinar, but we're going to have a bit of a deeper dive now. So to start with, I'm just going to set this up so that I'm scanning. You can see some options in my advanced options here for scanning that says scan rows and cells, columns and cells, blocks and cells. I'm going to use blocks, then rows, then cells. Let's just restore all the defaults so we are starting on a level playing field. So I've got my scan blocks, then rows, then cells. If I use my test grid now, we'll just check how that's working. So you can see now this time it's been broken up, the test grid has been broken up into two, and I can choose first of all a block on my page, and then I revert to a normal row column scan, the kind of scan I've been using today. So it can be a faster way on a big grid with lots of cells of moving around the grid. Let's have a look at that in practice and how we might manipulate that scan block pattern. So I'm going to come out of Fast Talker and I'm just going to pick a grid like Symbol Talker for a moment. And that's most of these grids have already had some setup so that some blocks have been set up on these pages. So let's see how that works on here. So I'm pressing my block, my cell, I beg your pardon, and you can see how it's got two main blocks on the page. One for the categories and then one for the functions. However, the special button is included in the first block, and I might want to change that to include that in the block that contains the clear and the speak and the keyboard and so on. So I want to make that change. I'm going to need to go into editing mode, not into settings. So editing mode, so go on to edit grid. I'm going to go to the option on the menu bar that says grid. And in grid you've got an option that you can turn on called scan blocks. And in scan blocks we use a color coding system just to help visualize what the scan block looks like. So you can see that I've got two main blocks, not including the first block, which is the writing area, scan block 2 and scan block 3. Now if I want to select the special cell and make that instead part of scan block 3, I can move over to the left hand side and just use the radio button next to that scan block, and you can see there that now the special cell will be included in that block. Let's just see how that one works. So I'll finish editing, start my scanning, and you can see now I've got a clean block, and then there we go, you can see that the special button is now included with my other functions. Now I may want to go one step further now and break this page up so that the topics pages, the category pages, are actually two blocks, not just one block. Go into edit grid, choose grid, scan blocks. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make use of a selection. I'm going to select one half of the block like so. I'm doing that by just dragging across the page, but another useful tip here is to make use of either the control key on a keyboard or the shift key. So I'm going to highlight at home. Now if I hold my shift key down on my keyboard and then select small words, you can see that everything is selected between those two cells. Now I want to make that scan block 2, that's correct. But I want to make everything from help to more to be scan block 3, and I want to make rest through to keyboard scan block 4, and I will also make the special cell part of scan block 4 as well. So I've just added an additional block. So if I finish editing, we'll just see that in action. 1 block, 2 block, 3 blocks. Okay, so nice and straightforward to set up. Key thing to remember is edit grid, grid, scan blocks. So the other thing we might want to do here is just think about what our content is. So some content will already be set up for particular access methods, although by and large in grid we're trying to accommodate lots of different access methods, which is why some tweaks, and this is one of the tweaks you might want to make, is often a good idea. Just think logically about what the most commonly used cells are going to be on a grid. They should be higher up, either in the scan or in the blocks. You want the most commonly used cells in the first blocks that you get to. So let's go to a different grid set to demonstrate that. So if I go into a grid set for a literate user now, and I go to Text Talker, I would typically make this scan block so that we've got some function keys, prediction and chat history kicks in before the keyboard. Because if the word I want is available, I want to get it to it as quickly as possible from the prediction cells. But what I also wanted to point out to you here is that sometimes there are keyboards that are better set up for different access methods. So within Text Talker, for example, and the same applies to the grid set alpha core, if you go into change keyboard, you have the option to make use of a frequency switch access keyboard. And the key thing to know about this is really what we've done is taken the letters, in this case of the English language, and laid them out to the high frequency letters you get to first. So if I was using a column row or a row column scan, I would get to those blocks first. I'll just see how that works. I've got my prediction. Okay, and now I want to begin selecting a letter. So I'm going to wait until I get to my keyboard block. Okay, the most frequently used letters appear first. I'm going for a G, which is a less frequently used letter. Okay, now I want the word good. So prediction is so powerful these days, I can get straight there. But just notice that if I wanted to, if I needed to, because O is quite a commonly used letter, it's right there. I get to it really quite quickly. So a frequency-based approach to either symbolized grid sets or text grid sets are a really useful thing to think about. So think about how you're laying things out. Don't be afraid to pick up a cell and move it about if you need to. So if someone really makes use of a lot of message banking, for example, then pick it up and move it around. Might save those changes. Okay, I'm going to come back out to Grid Explorer, and we're going to spend a couple of minutes now just thinking about alternative ways of scanning instead of switch scanning in the traditional sense. So I'm going to go back into Settings, and I'm going to go to Access and Switches. So up until now, we've just been exploring switch scanning, which is the most common method of using switches with grid. But if I choose that drop-down arrow, there's a couple of other options we can look at. And the one we're going to look at first of all is called switch elimination. Now, switch elimination makes use of groups of cells. It divides your grid either into halves or into quarters, depending on how many switches you're able to use. So you need to be able to use at least 2 switches, but you can use this with up to 4 switches if you're using a switch interface that allowed for 4 different switch inputs. Today, I'm going to demonstrate with this with just the 2 switches I have here. So let's go into activation. And I'm just going to, for ease of use, I'm going to change the color coding so it matches the color of my switches. So I've got yellow here, and you can see here I've got a red box and a drop down. And for my ease of use, I'm going to change that to yellow so it matches my switch and aide memoire. And the blue cell can change to green because that's the color of the other of the other cell that I have. Okay, I'm just going to also have a border color cell. There we go. All right, so how is this going to work? Let's just go into test grid first of all so you can see that. So if I press any switch, it highlights the grid into 2 blocks. So if I want to get to the last cell in the second row, that's currently in yellow, so I press my yellow switch. It is now in the green sector, so I'm going to press the green switch. It's still in the green, I'm pressing green again, it's still in the green, I've selected. Let's try that again. I want the last, so I want the first cell in the last row, in the 4th row. So it's green, it's still green, it's now yellow, it's yellow, it's yellow. So for someone with good control, and good cognitive control, this can be amazingly quick. Let's demonstrate that in a real grid set. So I'm now going to go into my Grid Explorer. I want to open Supercore 50. Pressing the yellow switch because that's the one that's select. It's opened it. Let's go into child. Start. Okay. So I'm going to press my switch to start. I want to say I, so it's yellow. Now it's green, so I'm pressing my green switch. It's yellow again, yellow again, yellow again, yellow again.
I,
and I'm selected. Okay. Now, every selection you make should be the same number of selections. So this is more efficient on big grid sets. So if I want to say want, yellow, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Everything is typically 7 presses. 7 presses to get want. And now I want to go to my spelling page, for example. So spelling is all the way down in the bottom right hand corner. It's green, it's green, it's green, it's green, it's green. And I made the same number of selections to get there. Every selection you make is the same number, so it's quite consistent. You just got to see the color patterns to see how they work. So that's called two-way elimination. 4-way elimination, if you can manage 4 switches, can be even more efficient because, again, with a big grid set, it's always the same number of selections. You're not having to wait a long time to travel across a big grid set. Okay, finally in this section, I just want to have a quick look at one final way of scanning with something called a switch joystick on this occasion. So what I have next to me is what looks like a fairly ordinary looking joystick. This is made by Praetorian and it's their new Jazz joystick, which is coming out soon. And although it looks like any other joystick, it's actually both a mouse joystick, a normal movement joystick, but can also be used as a switch joystick. So what does that mean? So I'm going to go into settings. And then again to switches. And you'll see here that I've got switch joystick as one of my options, which I've set. If I then go to activation, I can choose to move with joystick and activate with a switch. And I've got the option here to tap to advance. Now how this works, if someone has got gross motor difficulties or some motor difficulties but can manage a joystick but isn't that accurate with the joystick, it can be helpful to set this up so that you'll see at the moment my highlighting point is in the middle of the screen. I'll try and demo this on the joystick at the same time. If I pull down on the joystick, you can see as I tap the joystick, it's moving. If I make a movement, it doesn't have to be that accurate, it's roughly in the right direction. You can see me moving around to where I want to get to, and then I can either press a switch, or in this case I'm just going to press the button to make my selection. Okay, so it's just a fairly gross movement in any of the 4 directions. On this joystick, I've actually got full control. Other joysticks, you'll have almost like a gated joystick. It'll be a mechanical gate. This has got almost like a software gate. But as long as I'm roughly moving in the right direction, it'll allow me to move and then make my selection. So the other way to use that is with a hold to advance. And this time I'm going to go into Supercore, and you'll see my highlighting pointers in the middle of the screen on the cell put at the moment. So the idea is it always starts in the middle of the cell. So if I push up, there we go. You can see I've selected topics. I'm going to make my selection. I want to talk about celebrations. And then I can go on and talk about a particular time of year if I want to. So using a switch joystick, a gated four-way joystick, is another way in which you can use switch scanning. Okay, so whatever your switch scanning method, one other overriding access addition that's worth considering is to make use of some auditory feedback. We'll quite often work with users who have poor vision or who struggle to maintain their view of the screen, to keep watching the screen, and it can be quite useful for a user to hear what they've got highlighted before they make a selection. I'm going to go back into settings and back to switches, and then I'm going to choose my switch scanning option once more. I'm just going to restore my defaults. So in order to set up auditory highlighting, let's go into our switch settings and choose activation. Scroll down the screen that's shown until you get to the highlighting section, and ensure that you choose speak description when highlighting. The default, if you don't change anything, will be no sound when highlighting. So speak description when highlighting. We also need to select, make sure that a voice is selected for that purpose. So I'll go to my speech settings now and just check that I've got a normal speaking voice, in this case it's Graham, but that I've also got an audio feedback voice selected. And to demonstrate this best, I'm just going to choose a different voice for that. I'll choose Harry. And typically you might make the auditory feedback voice a little quieter. It's a private voice to support the user as opposed to their public speaking voice. If I now go into my test grid options, just check that everything's working as it should.
First row.
You can now hear some
Second
auditory
row.
feedback.
Third row. Fourth row. First row. Second row. Cell 7. Cell 8. Cell 9.
Okay. How would that look on a normal grid set? So I return back to Supercore.
First row. Jump home. Jump back.
I can jump back.
First row. Second row. Third row. Jump to animals. Jump to drinks.
And you can see now that I am getting an auditory cue as I navigate through my grids. Sometimes you want to be able to personalize the way that label is made. By default, it's made by going into Edit Grid, Grid, Audio Highlighting. The cell label provides the default auditory cue, auditory highlighting. So in this example, you can see drink, squash, tea, Coke, etc. will be the cue that's used, the message that's given by that auditory feedback voice. However, within this screen, it is also possible to make changes to the cue. So you can see here that Jump Home has got a new label on it. If I want to make that a bit shorter and quicker, I could literally click on the cell and overtype that with a new cue. Just have home and back, for example. Now, earlier in this session, we were looking at scan blocks. If I go to scan blocks, you can also label a scan block. So if I was to select that I want scan block 1 on this page to have its own label, you can see at the moment it just says top row, but I might want that block there to say actions. Okay. And then I might want scan 2, if I organise them appropriately, to say, for example, hot drinks. And you can see that I'm just highlighting the little in the text box and replacing the label with the appropriate cue. So that's how you can customize any scan block. And in the same way, you can also customize the labels for the different rows. So you can click in any of these text boxes and replace the label first row with a row that says actions row. Second row could be cold drinks, hot drinks, milk drinks, etc. So finally, I wanted us to talk a little bit about computer control and switch access. I'm going to go back to Grid Explorer, and I won't save my changes. I'm going to navigate to a computer control grid. So you can see here that I've got a computer control grid for switches, which I will just bring across to the screen that you can see. And you can see now that what's happened is that grid has shrunk to a small bar at the bottom of the screen, allowing me to see other cells around it. So if you're using switches, it works in exactly the same way, but now we can use our switch not just to control the grid, but to control other programs that we might want to use on our computer. To give you a quick example, I'll just show you how mouse mode can be used here. So I'm going to place my mouse cursor in the middle of the screen, and you can see if I start scanning
keyboard,
and I've still got that auditory
mouse
feedback on, and then if I choose the mouse grid, I can choose then to use one of the options on my grid here. So I've got 4 arrow keys and a radar. Now I'm going to start trying to push the mouse position up on the screen.
First row, left click.
And you can see now that the mouse cursor is traveling up on crosshairs up the screen until I press my switch again. I may want to push it left.
First row, second row.
And you can now see that it's traveling across the screen. And I'll press stop. So that way I can move my cursor to where I want it to be, and then I can choose left click to perform a left click or a double click or a right click in that position. And that's something where there is no other way of moving the mouse to a point on the screen. That allows anybody who's only using a switch to get anywhere on their computer. Another way of managing that, some users prefer and can be faster,
First row,
is to use radar mouse.
Second row, radar.
And what you'll see now is a very fine grey line moving around, a bit like a submarine sonar, roughly in the direction I want to go. So now the cursor is travelling quite quickly. I've got this set to move quite quickly across the screen, roughly to where I want to be. And then maybe I want to nudge it just slightly to the left in order to perform a left click on the Windows key.
First row, second row.
And I think I'm over that now, so I
First
can
row,
click.
left click.
Okay, and a left click would be performed. Now,
First row, left click. Right click. Home.
now in the same way, I might also want to use my grid and my switch to launch programs. In this particular grid set example, if I go to the cell called Start,
Keyboard. Mouse. arrows, FN keys, Windows, start.
You can see already there are some ready-made starting points ready for me to launch commonly used programs. Okay, and if I select one of those, it'll launch the program for me and allow me to start using it. Okay. So what I want to think about now, just to finish off with, is just some of the things we've covered today and some of the things you should bear in mind when you're thinking about switch access. So some of the things to consider that we've talked about today are scan method. Are you using one or two switches? Are you using some of the additional functionality? Are you using long holes? Are you doing a simple scan, a row column scan, or blocks? So thinking about the scan pattern there as well. What sort of timing does a user need? Have they got good control of the timing, or would they need some help where the timing was slowed down a bit to give them longer to hit their target? Do they need any filters or acceptance delays, meaning are they likely to make involuntary short presses or repeat presses? Do we need to consider those options? We've just heard some at the end of that session. Do we need some auditory prompts to help support navigation of a grid set? How many cells does somebody need? Using a switch, if someone's competent with a switch, you can actually have an awful lot of switches on the grid set, and we've covered some ideas today to help someone efficiently navigate a big grid set. Sometimes a high cell count grid can be more efficient to navigate than lots of smaller grids with not many cells on them. And finally, just to think and to bear in mind, look at what cells are used most commonly by the user. They need to be nearest the beginning of each scan. So you saw, for example, an example today, of the switch frequency keyboard that I showed you in Text Talker. The way a grid set like SuperCore is laid out, where the higher frequency letters tend to gravitate towards the top left corner of each grid, because that's where you start with a switch scan. So just some things there to consider as you're thinking about your switch access. I think one thing always to bear in mind is a clinician is always recommended when you're thinking about switch access. The presence of a physio or an OT or an AAC specialist can be really helpful. Their knowledge and experience, not just of positioning, but some of the fine tuning that's required can make all the difference. And making sure that you are helping, not hindering, someone's fatigue, as well as efficiency and comfort, for example. So there's some other useful resources that you can look at that will help with some of the decision making that we've looked at today. It's been around for a long time, but I think it's still useful. But if you go to the ACE Centre website, acecentre.org.uk, there's a really useful switch assessment and planning framework that's a really useful document to consider, very relevant, and is well worth looking at. And that's available free as a free download. There are plenty of other resources out there, but I just wanted to pick that one particular one out. The other thing that is worth a look is that there is also something called a scanning wizard, which you can get to. So I'm only going to throw up a screenshot of that for you. So this is what Scanning Wizard looks like. You can find it at scanningwizard.com. It's just a useful little tool, doesn't sit as part of the grid, but it's a useful little tool to help you work out what sort of timing someone might need, how accurate are they with their switch, and if they're not particularly accurate, what sort of settings might you want to apply. So for example, it will help you decide what, not just the timing of a scan, but any tremors and filters you may want to introduce for somebody. So a useful tool that you can do through at the assessment stage of planning for switch access with somebody. I wanted us to quickly also just share one last thing with you. So if I go to this screen again, a useful grid set that you can download is called Switch Timer. So I'm just going to add a grid set. Visit online grids. And by the way, this is also, as I touched on in part 1 of this webinar, this is a great place to look for switch content, because you can look for content by a category, and you can look for it by their access method. So if something has been particularly built with switches in mind, it might be worth looking here. I'm going to look for something called switch timer, which again is just a resource to help establish the best switch timing for somebody. Let's have a quick look at what it looks like. It's designed as a practice grid, allowing you to change the scan time as you practice. If we add that now and open it. Okay, so we can choose the scanning time. So we can say, right, we want to try something at a second. We can try our switch scan. Try it again. And we might decide that if someone's consistently getting towards the edge, the right-hand edge of that cell, they're getting quite close to missing it. So I'm going to go back and I'm just going to increase the scan time. I'm much more comfortable with that. Okay, so just some useful tools there to allow you to set a scan time and then to practice with that scan time. Hit the yellow star, and so on and so forth. So just some resources there to help you with things along the way. So we've come to the end of this webinar now. I hope that's been a useful run through. Quite a lot there to take in. It'll be available on the website, so you'll be able to dip in and out of it as you want to. Do not be afraid to contact thinksmartbox.com for help and advice. We've got a wonderful support team who can walk you through and remind you of some of these settings. But again, I will just reiterate, when you're coming to fine-tuning someone's switch access, an experienced clinician in this area is worth their weight in gold. Thank you ever so much for listening, and goodbye.